API design practices to accelerate development. As everyone's aware, with the MuleSoft application, there is an interface and an implementation, with the RAML part being the interface defining what you expect to put into the API and what you expect to get out, and the implementation being what we design in Anypoint Studio. I myself, Francis Edwards, have worked for Saint-Gobain for 3 years. It was my first time using MuleSoft when I started, and it was really my first introduction. I was there when RAML 0.8 was still being used within the older versions of Anypoint Studio, and the exam was still the 0.8. I'm going to describe some of the differences between that, because 0.8 was pretty much just a one-page description of your APIs, and the move to 1.0 was quite significant with the ability to use libraries and many other parts. To pass the 0.8 exam, I did it first time, open book exam. It was relatively easy to pass. The second, when I had an attempt at the 1.0 one, I decided not to do it with an open book and just see if I could get feedback from the exam and understand what I didn't know. And it took me a couple of attempts. So one thing I will point out to people is that if they're going to take the exam, they really do need to probably do the 2-day course that MuleSoft provide, as well as go through the RAML spec and understand how it's broken down. Saint-Gobain itself is a company that does building material distribution, so still running at the moment. And most of my work is to do the operations of file movements, although we're exposing an awful lot of APIs to be used within our new website. These are the resources I used for learning. The first is a book, Designing for Web APIs. That's available from A Press or Manning, maybe, one of the two, and Undisturbed Rest, which can be downloaded free from MuleSoft. Both those books make for interesting reading and beginning your journey on doing API specifications. There is an offline tool, which is useful in this time of working from home and with lacks of internet connections. API Workbench. It's a package that can be installed into the Atom editor. It's probably the most advanced. There are other tools for changing Swagger into RAML, for example, but those tend to be older packages. Workbench is probably the most up-to-date, although it hasn't been updated for a few months. Design Center is the one that gets updated all the time. That's the online cloud platform, and that allows you to design APIs, but you do have to be wary of any changes that they make, which usually happen every 3 months, which might invalidate some of the way you've written your RAML. You have to go back and check some of your old RAML code and make sure it doesn't have errors or warnings. The RAML specification itself is detailed in the Git project. I'll put the link here, and there's further resources on the RAML org website defining how it's progressed. The API course added a link to, which teaches you how to break down the code over 2 days. You basically learn how to build up a RAML right the way through to the final parts, which are extensions, which is really what I'm going to show you its most useful form that I found in the demo at the end. And then finally, there's a GitHub example repository that has example RAML code. Again, a lot of this dates from quite way back, and it tends to be quite on the simple side. It's hard to find good examples of quite complex RAML code and how it satisfies all the requirements of using RAML. So, practices that I found. What do you use RAML for? Well, first of all, use RAML within the HTTP requester. So if you are a designer and you are providing RAML code, the first use case that a developer will want is to be able to take the RAML and be able to put it into either the HTTP requester to say which resource and which method you want to request against what host and port and base path. The other thing you'd want to do is to put it into the API kit router, which is where the HTTP listener feeds into to route the errors. The HTTP requester is probably the lowest level. The API kit router allows you to use types and then makes validations against it. It acts a bit like a validation module and choice router joined together. The next requirement would be to create stubs in data. You can put example data into RAML code itself. I'm going to show you in a project how I've done it and how I find it allows you to create useful stubs at the end. Then there's the Design Center console. If you give access to the console and use the try it function, you'll want the console to work and give you correct responses back. There's a few gotchas in there, such as the security schemas requiring a null option, as well as OAuth2 or basic or any of the other security types to allow you to use the console effectively, especially if you haven't configured or have access to the OAuth2 servers, for example. It also requires the root element to be valid and ideally have all the code so that it can render correctly. This is where you have to watch out for how the enforcement of the code when creating the console changes over time. Finally then, once you publish a specification into the Exchange, you need certain elements of RAM where you can't have it too bare bones. You need a title for it to be able to create a Maven artifact within the Anypoint Exchange. It requires a version because this is used to populate the right-hand side where you have multiple versions and you iterate forward when creating new methods or creating updated parts to it. The documentation bit's useful because that can explain how the artifact can be used. You might want to point in how it can be pulled into projects, such as using the Mule Maven plugin. And then base URI is also important because that's important for the testing purposes and the API instances that are available against testing. Finally, you might want to apply policies against your API. Again, the RAML needs to be fairly complete. You need to have a base URI, you need to have a version, you need to have a title element, because those bits get auto-populated when you pull it from the Exchange within API Manager, and I can demonstrate this. If you don't have those filled in, you then have to start guessing or start finding out from other sources where that information resides before you can apply a policy. And then the service contract, that's the highest level object. That's where you become quite verbose in your API description. One of the problems that I find when you make a service contract is that if you put everything into one RAML file, it then doesn't render correctly when you have the console. It doesn't allow you to use some of the low down features like creating flows from the application. I should demonstrate that with my example project. So, demo time. I'm going to take you over to my version of the Design Center. I'm going to show you how I've structured the code, how I'm going to publish it into an Exchange artifact, and then how to pull it into Studio. Right, time to find the Design Center. Right, I've created a project here. A very simple project, but structured in a way that makes it useful in both the Exchange and within Anypoint Studio. What you may notice here is that I have the first bit of code that I wrote whenever I wrote a specification puts in all the necessary root elements and then puts through the resources, the methods, and what responses I expect. This is the minimum specification you'd require for something like a HTTP requester. It's very bare bones. It doesn't give you anything, doesn't give you any examples. It just satisfies that requirement for what you can post against a HTTP resource and what you can expect back. More ideally, you've got something that looks like this. And this is the minimum level I would describe as being useful for RAML for defining either the API kit router or for the HTTP requester. You don't need this HTTP requester if you populate all these fields within the main part of the API. I've put in all the root elements that are required that I mentioned in the previous slides. I've put in a title, so that title's reused in the resource line. I've put in a version that's reused in the base URL. I've also specified the minimum protocol, which I can extend later. I've put in types. Now, I find that types are most useful in the base RAML rather than separating them out as libraries. And the reason for this is because when you come down and specify the actual resource and the methods, you can define what types go into the API and what types go out. And I find that this allows you to then use these to create stubs later on. And I shall demonstrate that. So I'm not a big believer in using libraries, just because sometimes the design center is changing in how it produces the fat RAML file and how it produces the RAML file. I've only recently discovered that everything's included in the RAML except for the exchange modules, the attached libraries. If you pull the RAML file as a RAML zip, if you choose the fat RAML, you get the exchange modules, which includes any libraries that you might have pulled in. Then, so this one is not used. This one is the bare one, but I just put this in just to demonstrate how it behaves within the Anypoint Studio. Finally, you might want to have a service contract. Now, this is where extensions, the last bit you learn on the API design course, comes in handy. It's a RAML extension. It picks up all the detail that's been defined in the API kit router RAML, which is the base one, and then adds verbosity to it. So adds in security. That's in the fact they might be using a different protocol. You can add in a lot more description elements. There's a couple of reasons why you could use extensions. You could use it when you want to add new methods, but I particularly use it for fully populating the service contracts so that the console on the right-hand side works effectively. If I want to demonstrate why I've chosen this structure, you can see if I switch on the mocking service and then try out one of these resources, it'll use that mocking service. It doesn't use any authorization because it has a null in the secured by, and it demonstrates the resource correctly. You can see that the actual results it gives back are actually examples that are stored within the types here. So the fact that I have an example for the type that's specified allows me to have examples populating within the console. So once you've got your specification working, you will want to choose which file you choose as a root. I've chosen the service contract as the root because when I create the Exchange artifact, that is the main file that will be the overlay, the head of the Exchange artifact. So publishing it, we pick up details that are already populated. So it recognizes that it's a version 1. There are some previous versions that I've already saved, but all this business and asset name is all picked up from the title to create the asset ID, and that will publish to Exchange. I previously published this, so I shall go to Exchange and show you what that looks like. There's the artifact, and you can see the latest version is 1.10. It does pay attention to semantic versioning these days. There used to be a big history of all the different versions, but if you choose one level above, filters it down and gives you a smaller amount to filter through. As you can see, because it's chosen that main root file, all the documentation that I put into it, all the types are all shown within the definition over here with just attribute data over here. I could then edit this and put in a markdown file to explain how to use this and how to get it into your project. If you're familiar with downloading this, there are two different types of ways you can download the file. There is if you download it from the artifact like I've done there, you'll get a fat RAML, but there's also another file which is simply called the RAML, and that pulls down everything except for the libraries, which might make an API smaller if you don't need to have those attached libraries. The Mule Maven plugin essentially takes that string and pulls that into the projects, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate next. Here is a project I've created. I've just put some skeleton information in, and essentially I'm going to build this from the POM file. You'll notice there's no API tree here, but within the POM file, I've used the Maven C dependency plugin. Asked it to unpack, which means go and get a zip file and unpack it, and go to this location. Information from the thing that we saw, the name of the artifact, the fact that it's version 1.10, the fact that I want a fat RAML, so I want the entire contents, and my organization ID. So if I save this POM file, it's going to kick off a Maven job, which will go to the Exchange, grab that artifact, pull it in, unzip it, and populate the API for me. And so if I get a new version, all I would need to do is just be told by the designer that I've got a new version to get, maybe 1.2.0, and that would pull and overwrite any of the content that I have at the moment. So this structure, you might have recognized from earlier. I mentioned that this file here, which was quite bare, would be useful for a HTTP requester, but one of the things you want to do within Anypoint Studio is to use Mule to generate some flows. If you use this particular HTTP requester, you would get a simple file being created with stubs to data. But the main problem I have with it is that these payloads are not populated because there was no example data. So that's the reason why I said that the API kit router would make a better job, because it includes the type information. And when you generate the flows from that, you get the same structure, but within the payload stubs, you have the example data that was included within the examples, within the types. The service contract is a lot more verbose, and because it's verbose, with a lot of include statements, including lots of other files, it doesn't allow you to generate those flows from them. And that's the reason why I use extensions to essentially extend the base specification, which is usable by the developer, into a service contract that is more usable by people viewing the API and wanting to understand the API. One final thing to show you would be this API. Now that it's the exchange, I might want to apply policies to it. I mentioned that when you create the RAML, you want to have things like the base URI title. That's useful for things like API Manager, because once you're in API Manager, you can import one from the exchange. My project's called Manchester Meetup 3, and all these parts are automatically populated, including the implementation URL, because that was what was stored in the RAML. And then to save that would create all the necessary API auto discovery part information, and that would be then be useful to give to the designer. So that sort of information you may want to save and maybe put into the exchange, depending on if your exchange is available to external users. So you might want to put it onto this sort of page. And that really sums up what I wanted to show. The project that I've created here, I shall attach to the presentation and supply for later use if anyone wants to get an idea of what a good piece of basic RAML looks like and what's usable. Any other way that I've used RAML, I tend to find that you cannot satisfy all the requirements. You either make it too verbose and you can't use it to generate stubs, or you make it not verbose enough and you find that you don't have enough root use. So this is the best balance at the moment, although I do have to keep an eye on Anypoint Platform as changes happen every 3 months and I have to revisit this every 3 months. Okay, thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions?
You can either raise your hands or type the questions in the chat and we will see them.
Oh, that's good. Ah, we've got a question. Good.
Okay, I believe we don't have questions. Oh, okay, we have the first question.
Yes, I do find fragments have caused issues. Initially, when I started using fragments, it was because I was doing the boundary domain. I was establishing boundary context and not trying to build a too large canonical model. All that was probably understandable by solution architects out there. But what I found was that the fat RAML and the normal RAML artifacts that were downloaded from Exchange didn't quite fit that format It was in the past that when you downloaded just the simple RAML, you just pulled down the main root file. You didn't pull down any other files within the same level of the tree, or indeed any of the subfolder structure. So it was more useful to separate things into something that you wanted for one API and something that you wanted to include all the fragments in and to have as a boundary context. But it's not quite like that anymore. It's the FAT-RAML gives you the Exchange objects, all the libraries. The slimmed down version gives you everything in the root. And if you start putting everything in the root, it just looks well, it can get kind of messy quite quickly, and you lose your thread as to where things are. You can still achieve quite a lot of reuse simply by using things like types within the main page of RAML. The API kit router, that was the object after the listener. It's essentially a choice router and a validation module joined together. So if a request goes in and doesn't pass the validation because it validates against the RAML, so it validates against the types within the RAML, then it'll throw an error, and those errors can be captured and a suitable response returned. Otherwise, it recognizes what resource you looked for and what method you looked for and points it to the right flow for the implementation.
Francis, there's a couple of questions come through on the Q&A box.
Oh yeah. On the question bit.
In fact, they're all coming through now.
How do I do the data types in a library with inline examples? I find that if I use inline examples, or if I do include and point to examples, it doesn't get created in the payload stubs. They're useful for things like creating test cases. So if you're using Postman and want to provide examples for you doing Postman suites, then yes, you could include lots of example files or have them as inline. The only problem with inline as well is that if ever you're going to use this API, say your RAML is the source of truth and you want to produce a Swagger file, there is an ability now to copy the RAML and create a Swagger 2.0 file. We've had to do this with our organization when we use our Axway gateway, which handles our OAuth 2. So to create an implementation interface within Axway, we have to provide a Swagger file. Now, if I chose the verbose service contract, it would create a ridiculous file of 3,000, 6,000 lines, which just doesn't load into Axway. By having a more trimmed down version of just the fields and just the types and examples that are required for the API kit router, that allows me to have a smaller Swagger file that's only like 1,000 lines big that can load into Axway.
Thanks, Francis. Maybe a couple from Toby there.
I don't have any examples of how I've used this in Atom Editor. I find it much easier to use the Design Center than using Atom. I've used Atom a few times. It's not my editor of choice. I tend to use Notepad++ because I'm always using it for the XML and the JSON tools rather than Atom, because I find it a bit slower on my laptop. So it's not my go-to tool, I'm afraid. And has the console in the API kit ever worked for you? You mean the console when you debug the application and the console working? Yes, it has worked. And this particular one doesn't, or at least it didn't this morning when I tried to run it. But I know what you mean. Yes, it works in the console if you access it via an external browser, but within Anypoint Studio, the console bit at the bottom tends to not render correctly. It used to not render correctly if you had includes to any fragments. So when you comment out the fragments and when you remove the fragments, then you'd find that that console within the Anypoint Studio worked. However, this is a good example that did work 2 months ago and doesn't now without any updates to Anypoint Studio. So I think it's a bit of a moving target.
Francis, let's just take the last one from the Q&A box there from Eswari. And there's a couple more I think we can take from typed questions.
The base, going to need to go back to a few of these. That's quite a long question in the chat from Sunny. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I can probably answer that one offline. RAML 2.0 doesn't exist yet. It's just RAML 1.0, but yes, you can start learning RAML 1.0. It's essentially the same as RAML 0.8. It just allows you to have the fragments, although you do need to be clever on how you use the fragments, because the main reasons why you'd want to is to externalize libraries that you then pull into other APIs. That's the talk for another presentation that we're doing. The use of the base URI in RAML, it's there to populate things like the implementation URL in the API Manager. It's also used to provide locations of interfaces within the mocking services or the test services. And the only problem with base URI, it can only be specified once in the root RAML. If you try and override it with any extensions, it just doesn't get picked up. But that could just be a feature that MuleSoft haven't got round to implementing yet.
I think that's it, Francis. Thank you so much. If there's any more questions out there, maybe we could just put those on the chat, and maybe we could call back to some of those later. But Francis, fantastic. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And let's go over to Callie.